Turn off the lights, my dear friend. Let your room sink into darkness. Leave the present behind and step into the cold winter nights of the distant north. There, thousands of years ago, the sun would disappear for weeks on end, leaving behind a dense gray sky, wind howling over snow-covered mountains, and a frozen sea as silent as a cold mirror. In that picture, there were small but resilient people, the Vikings. They were not always the glorious warriors of legend, but first and foremost, they were people trying to survive. They had no electric heaters, no glass windows to block the wind, and certainly not the thick, warm blankets we have. All they had was wood, straw, stone, itchy wool, livestock, and a belief that every winter would eventually pass. Try to imagine stepping into a Viking longhouse. The space is dim, with only the yellow light from a burning coal pit in the middle of the house. Smoke curls up, lingering under the low thatched roof, making your eyes sting and your chest heavy. On the wooden platforms along the walls, the whole family huddles together, children placed in the middle, wrapped in fur in the arms of adults. On the other side of a partition, a cow breathes out a warm cloud of steam, helping to keep the house a little warmer. The smell of burning fat, smoke, and dry grass mixes into a thick air that is also the breath of survival. In that darkness, people were forced to draw closer. Privacy did not exist, but warmth did. The sound of storytelling would rise, sagas of gods and heroes, of battles with ice monsters, or sometimes just dry teasing to chase away the silent sorrow. The Vikings understood that not just the body, but the spirit also needed to be warmed. And so they lived, they endured, they overcame. Each winter was not a tragedy, but a trial, where people had to cling to each other, to the fire, to the belief that the dawn would still return. Tonight, relax, take a deep breath, and let this story take you on that journey. A journey through smoke and darkness, where people in woolen cloaks ate thick stew, drank sweet and sour mead, and sometimes had to sleep next to a cow to hold on to a fragile warmth. You don't need to worry about the cold out there. In this story, you will only hear the distant whistle of the wind, the crackle of firewood, and this gentle narration. Close your eyes. And with me, return to the winter nights of Scandinavia, where man and blizzard have wrestled for centuries, leaving for posterity a lesson that never grows old, that resilience sometimes is the only way to exist. And the foundation for that existence began with the very place they took shelter. When winter descended upon northern Europe, the Vikings did not flee. They retreated into the longhouse, their only fortress against the wind and snow. The structure was not beautiful, but it was effective. Walls thick with wood, stone, or turf, gaps stuffed with moss, mud, and straw. A roof covered in thick grass, which both insulated and protected from storms. From a distance, it looked like a large earthen mound, but inside it held enough warmth for a community to survive for many dark months. At its center was a fire pit that ran the length of the house, the heart of it all. The fire was for cooking, heating, and lighting. With no chimney, the smoke rose and collected under the roof, blackening the wooden beams before slowly drifting down. Everyone coughed, everyone's eyes were red, but the smoke also cured the hanging meat, repelled insects, and became the price to pay for breathing the next morning. Along both walls were high wooden platforms, the beds for the entire family. The mattresses were straw and grass, covered with animal hides. No one had soft duvets or mattresses, but they all curled up together, their breaths mingling, children lying between parents, the elderly near the fire. Each person was part of a communal heat battery. Privacy vanished, but life was preserved. The longhouse was also shared with livestock. A low partition separated humans from cows, goats, and sheep. On the coldest nights, their warm breath spread to the living quarters, becoming a reliable source of heat. The snorting of cows, the soft bleating of sheep, all contributed to keeping the ice outside from seeping into their bones. To the Vikings, warmth was more important than elegance. A stranger entering would probably find it dark, stuffy, and foul-smelling. But to the Vikings, it was the smell of life, smoke, grease, grass, damp wool, and human breath. Every dry cough reminded them they were still here. Every crackle of firewood was an affirmation that the blizzard had not yet defeated them. As night fell, they gathered around the fire. Sometimes it was a saga about the gods, other times just rough jokes to ward off the cold. Children would listen halfway and then fall asleep, their breaths mixing with the snores of the adults. The faint, hoarse notes of a lyre filled the void between the wind and the smoke. The entire house became a single organism, crowded, noisy, smoky, but resilient. The longhouse did not offer comfort. It taught people that warmth was more important than distance, that a wall of straw was a sufficient shield when everyone held hands. In the dense darkness of northern Europe, where winter seemed endless, it was this shelter that kept the Vikings alive. Not fragrant, not clean, but strong. But the longhouse was only the first line of defense. To step outside, even for a moment, they needed another, more intimate layer of armor. In northern Europe, clothing was not a style statement. It was a shield for survival. The Vikings wore many layers, stacking piece of cloth upon piece of hide, to preserve a warmth more important than honor itself. The innermost layer, if they were lucky, was linen. Thin, light, and breathable, but rare and laborious to produce. Most Vikings skipped it, wearing wool directly against their skin. Wool was the king of winter, thick, warm, and it retained heat even when damp. From morning till night, their bodies were wrapped tightly in coarse woolen garments, sometimes itchy, but indispensable. Men wore long tunics that reached their thighs, with trousers and leg wraps underneath, ancient but effective, keeping every muscle fiber warm. Women wore layered woolen dresses, thick aprons, and another overdress to shield them. Everyone wore a belt, not just to hold the tunic in place, but also to hang a small knife, a fire starter, or a cloth pouch with emergency food. Everything was within reach, because outside, the cold allowed no delay. The cloak was the final piece, a heavy mantle draped over the shoulders, fastened with a bronze or silver brooch. Many cloaks were lined with fur, becoming a wall against the wind. No one went outside without a cloak unless they did not intend to return. Their feet were also well protected. Shoes were made from the hide of cows, reindeer, or seals, hand-stitched and sealed with animal fat. Not beautiful, not fragrant, but waterproof and warm. In some regions, people used animal intestines, dried and sewn into crude raincoats. It looked strange, but in the snow and hail, it was more effective than any luxury item. On their heads, the Vikings wore felted wool hats. Felted wool, a type of wool that had been beaten, pressed, and matted until it formed a dense block, excellent at blocking wind and retaining heat. Gloves and scarves were also made from this material. When necessary, they would tuck their hands inside their sleeves, hiding their fingers in their armpits to preserve the last bit of warmth. The color of their clothing depended on the available dyes. Most were brown, gray, and beige, the tones of the earth and sheep. The wealthier could afford blue or red dyes imported from afar, but that was a luxury. Most Vikings lived their entire lives in the somber palette of nature. Most importantly, clothes were passed down through generations. A cloak could be mended time and again, from father to son, from mother to grandchild. Scraps of fabric were not wasted. They became socks, gloves, or extra stuffing for beds. Fashion here was not for show, but for survival. If you picture a Viking family stepping out of their longhouse on a winter morning, you would see them as figures bundled in wool, cloaks, and animal hides, walking slowly on the thick snow. There was no grace, no dashing appearance, but each layer of clothing was a declaration. We will not fall to this winter. The Vikings knew better than anyone. The cold does not care if you are a farmer or a chieftain. Only those who are sufficiently clothed, who can retain their warmth, will remain standing. And so, in their culture, wool, leather, and fur, materials that seem ordinary, became true treasures. And just like the outer armor, their bodies needed to be warmed from within, with the energy that sustained life. In the dim obscurity of the winter months, as the wind howled outside the longhouse, the Vikings found a simple comfort: food. It was not for savoring or presentation, but to keep the fire of life burning within their bodies. Food was the second blanket, a silent flame inside each person. The sea surrounding their land was cold but generous. From it they took fish, not just to eat fresh, but to preserve for the stormy months. Fish were hung from the house beams, smoked day and night, until they were hard and dry, each fiber infused with a scent of wood smoke and salty wind. Sometimes the fish were dried in the cold wind, sometimes salted, sometimes fermented, becoming a dish that was both strong-smelling and long-lasting, not delicious in the way we think, but in the darkness, even a small piece brought a sense of security. When they had meat from livestock or hunting, they did not waste it. A portion was eaten immediately in a warm feast, while the rest was salted, hung, or smoked. Slabs of pork and beef dangled from the ceiling, coated in smoke, dripping fat onto the fire. That smell mixed with the wood smoke, filling the house, becoming the familiar scent of winter. Rich, pungent, but also the smell of survival. In the middle of the house, there was always a stew pot over the fire. Into it, they threw everything left over from the day: a handful of grain, some leftover root vegetables, a scrap of meat, or just a few bones. The stew could simmer for days, its flavor changing with each addition, but it was always thick, warm, and hearty. Ladling a bowl of hot stew, inhaling the rising steam, and swallowing it down in the cold. This was how the Vikings kept life moving. Slowly through the long nights, grains were the foundation. From barley, oats, and rye, they cooked thick porridge or baked heavy, dense black bread. The bread was not soft and fluffy, not fragrant with butter, but hard, dense, sometimes mixed with tree bark to save flour. But just one slice, with a bit of butter or cheese, was enough to keep the stomach warm. Porridge was even more common, a pot of thin gruel with milk or water, shared among everyone: children, the elderly, and warriors. All found a gentle comfort in porridge, a simple but patient energy. From their livestock, they got milk. In the warmer seasons, milk was used to make butter and pressed into hard wheels of cheese for storage. In winter, this was a treasure. The salty, firm cheese could be nibbled on in small pieces, providing sustenance while reminding them that winter could not devour everything. A special dish was skyr, sour, thick, and dense, a reminder that life is not always sweet. The Vikings ate it not because they liked it, but because they needed it. And in that sharp sourness, their bodies found strength. And there was one more thing: alcohol. Beer and mead, sweet, rich, and warming. With one sip, the cold seemed to retreat, and the spirits lifted. During winter gatherings, a cup of mead was passed around, songs were sung, and laughter mingled with the howling wind outside. Food was scarce, but the joy of sharing made everyone feel warmer. Viking winter cuisine was not about feasting and pleasure, but about continuing on. Each piece of dried fish, each slice of black bread, each bowl of thick stew was a commitment to life. In the longhouse, amidst the smoke and fire, as the whole family sat around the hearth, passing bowls, their eyes meeting through the stinging smoke, they understood. As long as there was food, there was hope. But that hope could not exist without the two most sacred sources of heat, the heart of all life in winter. In the endless winter, where the ice seemed to freeze the very soul, the Vikings relied on two of the most sacred sources of heat, fire and livestock. A small flame and a breathing animal were sometimes the line between life and death. At the center of each longhouse was a fire pit that ran its length, burning ceaselessly for months. The fire was not brilliant, not blazing like at festivals, but usually just smoldering logs, glowing red in the night. The Vikings knew how to conserve, adding just enough wood to keep the fire alive, so the warmth would never die out. Because if the fire went out on a winter's night, the whole family would shiver in the dark, and no one could be sure they would wake up the next morning. Smoke from the fire curled up, seeping through the thatched roof, coating it with a thick layer of black soot. Eyes stung, throats were sore, but the fire brought peace of mind. It warmed chapped hands, dried damp shoes, and kept the stew pot simmering. The fire was the soul of the house, the quiet heartbeat in the long night. But the Vikings did not rely on fire alone. They also knew of another source of heat, simple yet powerful: the warmth from livestock. Inside the longhouse, a portion of the space was dedicated to them: cows, sheep, goats, sometimes even pigs. They stood there, breathing out clouds of white steam, warming the air thick with the smell of straw and smoke. A full-grown cow could radiate as much heat as a small fire. On a bone-chilling night, that warmth spread, mingling with human warmth, ensuring the house never became completely frozen. Children often huddled near the partition, lulled to sleep by the sound of a cow's heavy breathing. The adults, accustomed to the pungent smell of rot and manure, did not find it unpleasant. To them, it was the smell of life, proof that winter had not yet consumed everything. Keeping livestock indoors was also a form of protection. Outside, wolves and bears lurked, ready to snatch their most valuable assets. The cold could also kill the entire herd in a single night. By bringing them inside, the Vikings protected both their wealth and an additional source of heat. Humans and animals shared space, shared breath, and together fought against the frost. Of course, this was not idyllic. There was the noise of their calls, the strong odor, and sometimes an unexpected kick from a hoof. But it was all accepted, because in the harsh winter, warmth was more important than dignity. On stormy nights when the wind lashed against the wooden walls, the thatched roof shook and snow drifted down. Inside, the Vikings pulled their blankets tighter, added wood to the fire, and listened to the stirring of the livestock. The fire flickered, its trembling yellow light dancing on their faces. The sleepy murmurs of children, the low moo of a cow, all blended into a winter symphony, not serene, but full of warmth. In that world, fire and livestock were companions. Fire warmed from the outside in, livestock from the inside out. A dying fire and a breathing animal were enough to keep a fragile life going through another long night. The Vikings understood a simple truth. No one could fight winter alone. People needed each other, and they needed other living creatures as well. So when you close your eyes, imagine you are lying in a longhouse. The fire smolders, smoke drifts lazily, and on the other side of the wall is the steady breathing of a cow. Outside, the wind howls relentlessly, but in here you feel warm. A rough warmth, not clean, not pure, but enough to quiet your heart, enough to know you will see the light of tomorrow. And if the fire warmed the hands, and the livestock breathed out heat to warm the house, it was the community that warmed the Viking soul through the endless winter nights. No one could face the darkness alone, and the Vikings understood this better than anyone. In the longhouse, privacy was nearly non-existent. Everyone slept close together, ate together, and heard each other's breathing, snoring, and stirring. To us, that might feel constricting, but to them it was safety. Because warmth came not only from fur blankets and the fire, but also from the presence of others. Just knowing someone was lying right beside you, breathing steadily, was enough to make the darkness outside less frightening. As the night stretched on, it was not the cold, but the silence that was the greatest enemy. Isolation could make the mind heavy and weary, and that's when the community spoke up. The Vikings told stories to one another. They recited the sagas, the epic poems of gods and heroes, of battles between men and monsters, of long journeys across the sea. The narrator's voice, steady and rhythmic, mixed with the crackling of the fire, allowing minds to drift from tension to tranquility. Each story, whether exaggerated or crudely humorous, brought strength, a reminder that they were not alone in their fight against winter. Songs also rose, not sweet melodies, but often hoarse, powerful chants, as if the wind itself were being called to sing along. These songs were not just for entertainment, but to remind them, we are still here, we are still alive, we still have a voice to raise. On special occasions like Yule, the community gathered in even larger circles. Food was shared, salted meat, dried fish, black bread, hard cheese. Mead was passed from hand to hand, and laughter rang out, mingling with the howling wind outside. Games also appeared, a board game, a riddle, a sudden arm-wrestling match. Not to win or lose, but to fill the emptiness, to keep spirits from succumbing to the winter. Even on ordinary days, sharing was a habit. If one family ran out of bread, another would offer their reserves. If a roof collapsed, neighbors would help rebuild it. Everyone knew that winter did not forgive selfishness. Helping others was helping oneself, because spring would only come when everyone had made it through the cold together. Children were raised in the arms of the entire community. The elderly were cared for like small flames needing shelter. No one was left behind. No one was abandoned to fate in the night. The strength of the community lay in that bond. Each person became a link in a chain, each breath a part of a collective warmth. And so, amid the seemingly endless nights, when blizzards consumed the sky, the Vikings still found peace, not in material comfort, but in the laughter, the stories, and the presence of others. They understood that the fire could die, the livestock could fall, but if the community still sat close together, then winter, no matter how long, was just a road that could be traveled. So imagine this. In the longhouse, the firelight flickers on faces. Smoke hangs thick under the thatched roof. Someone is telling an ancient story. A child has fallen asleep in their mother's lap, and the adults smile faintly at the sound of their kinsman's snore. Outside, the sky is covered in snow, but inside, the community breathes together, lives together, and because of that, they passed through the winter, one night after another, until the light of spring returned. Of course, that community bond needed a physical space to be nurtured, a fortress built from the simple materials that nature provided. When winter gripped the lands of northern Europe, people could only rely on what nature offered to build a shelter. The Vikings had no double-paned glass, no fired brick walls or industrial materials. Instead, they had wood, stone, straw, mud, moss, and an enduring patience. From these simple things, they created a suit of armor for the longhouse, enough to block the biting wind and hold onto a fragile warmth. The walls were often nearly a meter thick. If wood was available, they arranged it in rows of stakes, filling the gaps with mud and straw. In regions with few trees, they used stone, building thick, heavy walls and sealing every crack with dry grass or discarded animal fur. Every crevice was filled by hand, with skill and a touch of desperation. The Vikings knew even a tiny gap would let the winter wind pour in like a cold blade. The roof was the second shield. The most common was a thatched roof, thick and steep, so snow would slide off instead of weighing it down. But the best type of roof was a turf roof, a thick layer of earth with a carpet of grass growing on it. When winter came, the grass dried and hardened, forming an excellent layer of insulation, trapping warmth inside like a natural blanket. Sometimes an extra layer of snow on the roof became a supplementary coat, an unconventional but effective insulator. The floor was usually just packed earth, trampled down until it was as hard as rock. People spread straw, rushes, or reeds on it to make their steps less chilling. When the straw rotted and the musty smell became too strong, they would lay a new layer on top, simple, rustic, but enough to keep their feet from touching the cold ground directly. Windows were almost non-existent. A draft through a narrow slit was enough to make the whole house tremble. So daylight only entered through small holes or a slightly ajar door. At night, only the fire and a few oil lamps made from animal fat provided light. The house was therefore dark, smoky, and heavy. But this darkness also preserved the warmth, enveloping the entire family in a rough cocoon. The Vikings used everything they could. Moss was stuffed into the cracks in the walls, not only for insulation, but also to absorb moisture. Scraps of fur became filling material. Even old clothes and worn wool were stuffed into the partitions. Nothing was wasted because every straw, every piece of fabric, could be the thin line between shivering and a peaceful sleep. From the outside, the longhouse looked like a dark, rustic, unimpressive mound of earth. But step inside and you would feel the difference. A quiet warmth, heavy with the smell of smoke and dry grass, but enough to keep your skin from freezing, enough for you to lie down and fall asleep. Every wall, every thatched roof, every layer of moss stuffed in the wooden cracks whispered a promise: we will keep this warmth in for one more night. Strangely, it was this simplicity that created an astonishing resilience. The natural materials, when combined, turned the house into a giant stew pot, where human breath, livestock breath, and the red flame mingled, accumulating in the enclosed space. There was no comfort, but there was preservation. There was no luxury, but there was survival. And when the snow fell, blanketing the roof, when the storm roared outside, those walls of mud, stone, and straw stood firm. The longhouse became a shelter, not perfect, but steadfast. Night after night, it embraced the family inside, keeping them warm enough, safe enough to wait for the dawn. Imagine you are lying in that longhouse, your back against a thick wall stuffed with moss, your ears listening to the wind whistle outside, yet you feel a quiet warmth surrounding you. There are no electric blankets, no glass windows, only earth, wood, grass, and the skill of human hands. And from these simple things, a small miracle occurred. Winter was no longer absolute, and life went on. And to sustain that life through each long night, sleep was not merely rest, but had become a true survival strategy. Amid the northern European winter, when darkness lay thicker than the snow and ice, sleep was more than just rest. For the Vikings, it was a survival strategy. Going to sleep was like building a fortress, where body and mind could find some safety from the harsh cold. In the longhouse, beds were not beds as we know them. Along the walls were rough wooden platforms covered with straw, moss, or dry grass. On top of that, people spread animal hides, old woolen clothes, anything that could add a layer of softness and retain heat. There were no soft pillows, no duvets, only hard pieces of leather and communal warmth. But it was in that rustic place that the winter slumbers nurtured the strength of a whole people. Everyone slept in the same clothes they wore during the day. Taking off clothes in sub-zero temperatures was like inviting death. Shoes were sometimes even worn to bed, both to keep warm and to be ready to step outside in the dark if needed. Thick woolen cloaks and fur-lined capes became blankets. Those who owned a bearskin or reindeer hide had a treasure, heavy and warm, enough to defy the howling wind outside. The sleeping arrangement also had its own order. Newborns were wrapped tightly in cloth and placed between their parents. Older children squeezed in between their siblings to receive warmth from both sides. The elderly, vulnerable to the cold, were placed near the fire. The entire family, sometimes even relatives, lay side by side in a long row. No one had their own space. Privacy gave way to survival. They became a single unit, a collective heat nest, where each body contributed to keeping the person next to them warm. Viking sleep was also filled with smells: smoke, damp wool, animal fat, the scent of rotting grass. But in the darkness, as eyes slowly closed, it all blended into a heavy curtain that enveloped the body. The smell was no longer unpleasant, but a familiar sign that you were inside, in the arms of the community, and that while winter might be raging outside, it could not reach you. Some wealthier families would place heated stones or fired bricks under their beds, creating a gentle, lingering warmth like an ancient hot water bottle. But most just had to rely on each other. An arm thrown across, a foot pressed close. It was not out of romantic affection, but out of the instinct to preserve heat. There, the boundaries of modesty disappeared. Closeness was no longer a choice, but a way to survive. Sleeping in the longhouse also meant accepting the smoke. At night, when the fire burned low, the smoke descended. Young children and the elderly, lying closer to the ground, inhaled the most smoke. They coughed dryly, their eyes stung, but they still drifted off to sleep from exhaustion. Above, meat and fish hanging from the rafters continued to be cured, the smoky flavor seeping into every fiber of cloth, every strand of hair. The Vikings grew up in that smoke, considering it an inseparable part of life. Sleep was never completely silent. The howling wind outside, the stirring of livestock, the crackling of firewood, the steady rhythm of snores. It all merged into a symphony of a winter's night. Against that backdrop of sound, people let themselves go, let their bodies relax, and let their minds drift away from the cold and darkness. They slept, not because they wanted to, but because they needed to. Because only in sleep could the body recover and retain strength for another long day of struggle. Try to imagine you are lying on that wooden platform, your back against a moss-stuffed wall, with the steady breathing of a loved one beside you. A heavy woolen cloak covers you, and your feet touch the shoes that still smell of animal fat. The space is filled with smoke, your eyes sting, but as your eyelids close, everything begins to fade away. All that remains is the wind outside, the crackling of the fire, and the warmth from the bodies lying close by. The winter night is long, but in that sleep, you temporarily forget it all. For the Vikings, sleep was not a luxury. It was a sophisticated strategy, combining clothing, fire, animal hides, and the bond of the entire community. Thanks to those smoky, snore-filled slumbers, they made it through each harsh winter, so that every morning when the faint light of the sun shone through a crack in the door, they would wake up, shivering but still alive. And upon waking, the first thing they sensed, besides the darkness and the warmth, was the smoke, the uncomfortable yet necessary companion of winter. If there was one thing that enveloped the Viking longhouse, besides darkness and warmth, it was smoke. Smoke crept into every corner, coated every wooden beam, clung to hair, skin, and even dreams. To live in a longhouse was to live in a sea of smoldering smoke, and the Vikings somehow grew as accustomed to it as they were to the wind and snow outside. In the middle of the house, the fire pit burned day and night. The fire sustained life, but it also produced smoke with no escape. There was no tall chimney reaching for the sky, only a small hole in the thatched roof, sometimes open, sometimes covered by snow. The smoke rose, hit the low ceiling, and then lingered, accumulating into a hazy curtain. At first, it coated the wooden beams in a thick black layer. Gradually, it descended, mixing with the air everyone breathed. The Vikings inhaled smoke every day, to the point where their lungs seemed to have grown accustomed to the smell of burning wood. Young children coughed dryly, their eyes red and stinging, but they grew up in that atmosphere. The elderly, though frail, still sat by the fire, letting the smoke surround them like a heavy but familiar cloak. Breathing fresh air was almost a foreign concept. They lived with smoke, worked in smoke, and fell asleep under a black, smoky roof. The strange thing is that the smoke did not only bring discomfort, it also became a silent ally. Thanks to the smoke, the meat and fish hanging from the rafters did not spoil. The acrid smell penetrated every fiber, turning them into precious winter reserves. Thanks to the smoke, insects were few, and mold struggled to grow. Even the house itself, with its wooden walls and turf roof, was coated in smoke like an invisible protective layer, warding off dampness and termites. Of course, it cannot be said that the smoke left no trace. Everyone's chest felt heavier after the winter. Coughs became a familiar sound, interspersed with laughter and storytelling. Everyone's hair was imbued with smell, to the point that the scent of smoke became the characteristic fragrance of winter. And their eyes, bloodshot, always looked as if they had just been crying, not from sadness, but simply because of the silent, clinging smoke. Some cleverer families built high sleeping platforms to avoid the thick layer of smoke that collected low to the ground. Some would open a crack in the door when the smoke became too heavy, accepting a blast of cold wind in exchange for a bit of breathable air. But most just endured it because they knew smoke was a part of winter, just like snow and wind. It could not be eliminated, only learned to live with. On quiet nights, the smoke even contributed to a mystical atmosphere. The firelight flickered, scattered by the smoky screen, turning the longhouse into a dimly lit, shimmering cave full of dancing shadows. Children would look into it and imagine monsters and gods, making the stories they were told even more vivid. The elderly would watch the smoke drift, as if seeing a thin thread connecting them to the world beyond. The smoke also taught people about endurance. Every heavy breath was a lesson in patience. Every night of stinging eyes was a reminder that life is never easy. But it was by living in the smoke that the Vikings learned to be resilient, both in body and spirit. Try to imagine you are sitting in the longhouse, the fire flickers, smoke lazily curls around the thatched roof. The faint yellow light is dimmed by the gray haze. You take a breath, your chest feels heavy, your eyes water, but then you slowly relax. Here, smoke is not an enemy, but a companion, a somber soundtrack to the long nights. Outside, the wind howls coldly. Inside, the smoke embraces you, wrapping you in its heavy but familiar arms. And so you drift off to sleep, in a space that is both suffocating and, in its own way, gentle. But endurance was not everything. To fight against the gloom of the darkest days of the year, the Vikings lit a fire of joy and hope. On the darkest days of the year, when the sun seemed to have vanished below the horizon, the Vikings found a way to combat the gloom. They celebrated Yule, a sacred and joyous winter festival. Amidst the bone-chilling cold, Yule was a spiritual torch, a reminder that winter, no matter how long, could not extinguish human joy. Yule began around the winter solstice as the longest night passed, a sign that the light would eventually return. In the longhouse, the fire was built larger and brighter, as if to challenge the darkness outside. A massive log, called the Yule log, was placed on the fire, where it would smolder for days. That fire not only provided warmth, but also symbolized continuity, the hope that the sun would return and that winter would pass. Food, which had been carefully preserved, was brought out in greater abundance than usual. Salted meat, dried fish, hard cheese, and black bread were all shared among family and neighbors. Sometimes an animal was sacrificed, both as an offering to the gods and for the whole community to enjoy a feast. In the smoky haze of the longhouse, the aroma of roasted meat, mead, and grain porridge blended into a rich culinary tapestry, a stark contrast to their usual austerity. And most importantly, there was mead. The golden, shimmering drink was passed from hand to hand, bringing warmth and exhilaration. As the alcohol spread through their bodies, the cold seemed to retreat. Laughter grew louder, and stories were told with more vigor. The Vikings sang, their songs hoarse and sometimes off-key, but full of life. In those songs there was gratitude, defiance against the winter, and the belief that they were still here, as resilient as the ever-burning Yule fire. Yule was also tied to mythology. It was believed that in winter, the boundary between the human world and the spirit world grew thin. Gods, ancestors, and even wandering spirits could step into the long night. Therefore, the Yule festival was not just about eating and drinking, but also a spiritual ritual. They made offerings, hung charms, and recited prayers, asking the gods for blessings, the ancestors for protection, and hoping that mysterious forces would not harm their families, livestock, or crops. Greenery was also brought into the house, not for decoration, but to symbolize eternal life. In the midst of winter, when everything was withered, an evergreen branch brought hope that life still remained, that spring would return. These customs, over time, planted the seeds for the Christmas traditions we are familiar with today. During Yule, the Viking community did more than just eat, drink, and sing. They played games, told riddles, and even had impromptu wrestling matches right in the longhouse. The sound of laughter drowned out the wind outside, and cheers made them forget the cold. Children ran around the fire, adults sat telling sagas, and everyone shared a single rhythm. The rhythm of life against the darkness. If you were to step into a longhouse during Yule, you would see the flickering firelight on faces flushed with mead, and hear laughter and song mixed with the clatter of bowls. The air would be thick with smoke, reeking of meat and beer, yet filled with warmth. For a few short days, the cold outside seemed to have lost its power. Yule was more than just a festival. It was a testament to the spiritual strength of the Vikings. They knew the winter was long. They knew danger was always lurking. But they also knew how to create joy and light a fire of hope. And in that joy, they found the strength to carry on, one night, 1 week at a time, until the sun returned. Imagine you are sitting in the longhouse, the Yule log glowing red before you, surrounded by faces radiant in the firelight. Someone is singing, someone is telling a story, and a cup of mead is passed into your hands. Outside, the wind still howls, the snow still falls, but here you feel warm, you feel joyful, and you believe that spring will come again. That joy and hope warmed the spirit, but for the body not to succumb to the cold, they had to rely on an even closer and more enduring ally. Of the countless materials the Vikings had at their disposal, none was more intimate and important than wool. It was not just fabric, not just clothing, but the silent shield, that helped people get through the winter. If the fire warmed the house, if the livestock breathed out heat to sustain the community, then wool was the protective layer that clung to the body day and night. Wool came from sheep, patient creatures that grazed on the hillsides, indifferent to the cold wind lashing their backs. Each season, their fleece was shorn, washed, carded, and spun into yarn. That yarn, through patient hands, became fabric. This process took place year-round, but in winter, it was more crucial than ever. In the dense darkness of the longhouse, as blizzards raged outside, you could see the hands of women and children, silently spinning yarn, weaving cloth, preparing for the cold seasons to come. Wool had a secret. It retained warmth even when damp. In a land where rain, fog, and snow were constant companions, this was a simple but priceless miracle. A thick woolen tunic, though heavy, was enough to protect the body when venturing out into the freezing wind. A woolen cloak, lined with animal hide, became a fortress against the entire winter. Viking men wore long woolen tunics, along with trousers and leg wraps. Women wore layered woolen dresses, with an overdress and apron. Over their shoulders, everyone had a woolen cloak, fastened with a metal brooch. All of it was thick, heavy, and sometimes itchy, but no one cared. Because each layer of wool was a layer of warmth, a reason to survive another day. It wasn't just clothing. Wool also became socks, gloves, hats, and scarves. Vikings wore felted wool hats, a type of wool that was beaten and pressed into a dense block, offering superior heat retention. Sometimes wool was even stuffed into shoes as a lining to keep feet from going numb. Children were wrapped in woolen blankets, the elderly covered with old woolen cloaks. Scraps of wool were even stuffed into the walls of the house as an extra layer of insulation. Not a single thread was wasted. Wool also carried a mark of distinction. Coarse, gray-brown wool was usually for the common folk. Fine, tightly woven wool, sometimes dyed, was a sign of wealth. A tunic dyed bright blue or red not only kept you warm, but also showed that the family had trade connections and ties to distant lands. But whether rich or poor, wool was the common denominator. Everyone relied on it to fight the winter. Wool accompanied people all day and all night. They wore wool in the fields. They wore wool while rowing. They wore wool to bed. On the wooden platforms of the longhouse, with woolen blankets underneath and woolen clothes on top, the warmth from the fibers seeped into their skin, gently lulling their bodies to sleep. No one called it a luxury. It was just a necessity, like breath, like fire. Imagine one winter morning the fields outside are white with snow. You put on a heavy woolen cloak, fastening the brooch at your shoulder. Stepping out the door, the cold wind cuts your skin, but the wool keeps your body from shivering. The fabric is coarse. The smell of flax and smoke clings to it, but you know it has saved you, and it will continue to save you for months to come. In Viking culture, gold and silver might have been wealth, but wool was truly life. It was woven from labor, from patience, from care itself. A woolen tunic could be passed from father to son, from mother to grandchild, mended time and again, but it still fulfilled its duty, to keep warm. Wool did not glitter like jewels, nor was it as sturdy as stone, but it was what accompanied the Vikings through blizzards, through long nights, through winters where the sunlight was just a fleeting glimpse. And thanks to those simple woolen threads, they survived. they passed through the cold seasons, and when spring returned, they set sail again, planted seeds in the fields, or simply sat by the fire weaving new cloth. But don't be mistaken into thinking they only huddled by the fire, wrapped in wool. The Vikings also had a bold, contrasting habit to master the cold. In the icy world of the Vikings, where the cold seeped into every inch of earth and every breath, one might think they did nothing but huddle by the fire. But strangely, it was in that very land that they enjoyed a paradoxical pleasure: hot saunas and ice-cold baths. It was both a hygienic habit, a ritual, and a way to remind the body that it was still alive. The Vikings called their sauna the badstofa. These were not luxurious bathhouses, but small huts built of wood, stone, and turf. Inside, large stones were piled up and heated in a fire until they glowed red. Once scorching hot, water was poured over them, causing a thick, dense steam to rise, turning the entire room into a humid, misty sea. Inside, people would sit crowded together, sweat pouring from them as if all the dirt, hardship, and even the fear of winter were being washed away. Heavy breathing filled the air, mingling with the sizzling sound of water hitting hot stones. The air was thick and sweltering, a complete contrast to the biting wind howling outside. In that moment, the body was liberated, relaxing after days of huddling in the cold. But the ritual did not end there. After sweating profusely, many Vikings would run straight outside and plunge into a frozen stream or roll around in the white snow. The shock of the cold made their skin sting, their hearts pound, and their breath catch. But it was in that very moment that they felt most intensely alive. Fire and ice, hot and cold, blended into a sequence of experiences that the Vikings believed made the body healthy and the mind strong. This habit also had a communal aspect. An entire family or even a whole village might enter the sauna together. Men, women, and children all shared the space, not just for cleansing, but for bonding. In the misty steam, stories were told, laughter rang out, and secrets were shared. The sauna became a place that was both private and communal, a space untouched by the winter wind. For the Vikings, the sauna was also a healing ritual. The sick were brought there to sweat out their illnesses. Women gave birth in the warm steam, and newborns were washed in their first mist. They believed that the heat and steam purified the body, drove away evil, and brought a new balance. When combined with an ice bath, the ritual became a perfect cycle of opposites: heat to the bone, then cold to the heart. It was like a mental challenge, a declaration to oneself: I am not afraid of winter. And then, upon returning to sit by the fire, wrapped in a thick woolen cloak, they would feel their bodies light, their minds clear, and once again ready to face the long, arduous blizzard. If you imagine yourself there, stepping into a badstofa with the Vikings, you would feel the thick steam surrounding you, the sweat dripping down your skin, and then, immediately after, the piercing cold of 1,000 needles as you dive into the snow. But then, back by the fire, as your body shivers from the contrast, you would feel warmer than ever before. The Vikings had found a simple secret in this habit. To survive the endless cold, sometimes you have to face it directly, even welcome it, and then return to the embrace of warmth. It was how they balanced the two extremes, turning both heat and cold into allies. And because of this, they made it through the long winters, not just with physical strength, but with spiritual resilience as well. And that resilience was tested not only by the cold, but also by a quieter enemy, the endless waiting and the boredom of long days confined indoors. Winter in Northern Europe was not just about the cold. It was also about the endless waiting. The days were short, the nights were long, snow covered the paths, and the wind howled for weeks on end. The fields were frozen, the sea was trapped by ice, and long journeys were impossible. The Vikings were forced to stay in their longhouses for days at a time, and it was then that another enemy appeared: boredom. But the Vikings knew how to fight it. They filled their time with work, games, and storytelling, all blending into a mental life no less vibrant than the short summers outdoors. In the smoky longhouses, women and children sat spinning wool. Their hands moved steadily, patiently, turning sheep's fleece into fine thread, and then into thick cloth in preparation for the next winter. It was not just labor, but a rhythm, the soft whir of the spinning wheel, the clatter of the loom, mingled with the crackling of the fire, creating a steady soundtrack of perseverance. The men made repairs. Weapons were sharpened, axe handles were replaced, and bows were restrung. Farming tools were mended, and hoe blades were hammered sharp. In winter, when they could neither plant nor conquer, they turned inward, focusing their efforts on preparing for the return of the light. Children, though huddled in thick woolen clothes, still found joy. They played simple games with bones, stones, and wood. Dice made from animal bones were thrown, rolling across the dirt floor, their clatter producing peals of laughter that drowned out the wind outside. Sometimes a small wrestling match would fill the whole house with noise, enough to startle the livestock. And then, when the night grew very long, it was time for stories. The Vikings had a tradition of telling sagas, oral epics filled with mythology, history, and imagination. In the flickering firelight, a slow, steady voice would rise, speaking of gods fighting monsters, of heroes sailing to distant lands, or more simply, of a relative who once tripped right outside the door. Laughter would erupt, followed by sighs, and then silence as the whole house imagined the grand or tragic scenes. These stories were not just for entertainment, they were the stream of memory, connecting one generation to the next. Children listened, memorized, and one day would retell them, adding their own details so the stories would live on in the community's memory. In the middle of winter, storytelling was the way to keep the mind from being swallowed by darkness. Board games also made an appearance. Hnefatafel, the Vikings' strategic game, was played on a wooden board with pieces carved from bone or wood. Players strategized, moved, and counterattacked. The whole family would watch, discuss, and learn to think and be patient. The game was both a pleasure and a way to train the mind during the long months of inactivity. All of these things, spinning, mending, storytelling, playing games, may seem small, but they were the threads that kept the Vikings connected to sanity and hope. Without them, winter would not just be cold, but a prison for the mind. Try to imagine, in the longhouse, the fire smolders, smoke curls around the thatched roof. A man is hammering an axe blade. A woman is spinning thread. Children are giggling over a set of dice. Then someone begins to speak, slowly, warmly, and everyone listens. Outside, the wind still howls, but inside, life flows on. The Vikings understood that winter tested not only the body, but also the spirit, and they had found a way to overcome it. With labor, with games, with laughter, and with stories passed down from one generation to the next. In the darkness, they created their own light, not the light of the sun, but the light of the mind and soul. And hidden behind all those activities was a deeper secret, an invisible weapon that helped them overcome the long winter. It was their mentality, the way they looked at the world, the way they accepted hardship as a natural part of life. If the body needed a cloak and a longhouse to shield it from the cold wind, the soul needed a different kind of coat, one of resilience, calmness, and a touch of stoicism. From birth, Vikings grew up in a harsh environment. Children were not coddled with luxuries. They learned to endure the cold, to fall and get back up, to laugh when their hands were numb. To them, hardship was not an enemy, but a test. Every winter, no one was surprised, no one complained. The Vikings did not ask, "Why is it so cold?" They simply prepared and whispered, "This year we will get through it." In their minds, pain, hunger, and loss were all normal parts of life. Complaining did not make the snow melt, and resentment did not stop the wind from blowing. Instead, they found strength in silence and acceptance. The Vikings considered endurance a virtue and hardship a necessary part of becoming a mature person. Norse mythology also nurtured this mentality. They believed in a universe where cold and darkness were real forces. In the sagas, the gods often faced endless winters and enemies of ice and night. The image of Fimble Winter, the eternal winter before the end of the world, was deeply ingrained in their imagination. When you grow up in a culture that believes even the apocalypse begins with a winter, you learn not to fear the cold. It is no longer a surprise, but an inevitability. This stoicism was reinforced by the community. In the longhouse, where space was tight and the smoke was thick, people learned to be patient, to tolerate their neighbors' snoring, and to laugh when their porridge bowl was only half full. They did not seek comfort, but peace in sharing. And when someone cracked a witty joke in the gloomy winter, the whole house would laugh, dispelling the heaviness. Children were taught that the biting cold was no reason to stop. If your fingers were numb, use your elbows. If your toes ached, walk faster. Each small hardship overcome was another brick in the foundation of their character. As an adult, a Viking warrior not only knew how to wield an axe, but also how to look straight into a blizzard without flinching. Imagine, in the longhouse by the fire, an old man tells the children about the winters of the past. He speaks in a slow voice. Winter does not want us to survive, but we did, and you will too. The children listen, their eyes shining in the firelight. The lesson did not need to be written in a book. It was passed down through the telling, through a look, through the way the Vikings sat up straight in the face of darkness. That was their mental strength, not denying hardship nor exaggerating it, but seeing it as part of the journey. The cold was just a challenge, and a challenge could be endured, could be overcome. For the Vikings, this mentality was an invisible treasure. It could not be hung from the rafters, like smoked meat, nor woven into a cloak like wool. But it was the most durable thing of all, helping them through hundreds of winters. Every breath in the thick smoke, every smile amidst the howling wind, was a declaration, "We are still here." And that affirmation was never uttered alone. because deep in their consciousness lay a simple but core truth. In the icy world of Northern Europe, where winter stretched on like an eternity, the Vikings understood a simple truth. No one could survive alone. Even if you had the thickest woolen cloak, the sturdiest longhouse, or the healthiest livestock, you still needed others. True strength did not lie in the individual, but in the community. Each longhouse was not just a self-contained family, but part of a larger network: the village, the clan, the allies. When winter arrived, that network became a safety net, where everyone held on together to get through the blizzard. If one family ran short of food, another would share. If a roof collapsed, neighbors would come to help rebuild. It was not out of simple generosity, but because everyone knew, today we help them, tomorrow they will help us. Firewood was gathered collectively, food was stored in a common storehouse, and dried meat hanging from the rafters was distributed according to need. This sharing not only sustained the body, but also nurtured trust. In a place as dark and harsh as a Scandinavian winter, trust in one another was a rare source of light. During winter feasts, especially at Yule, this bond became even more apparent. The entire community would sit around a large fire, eating, drinking, and singing together. Not just to celebrate, but to affirm, we are still here, and we are here together. Amidst the laughter and song, the darkness outside suddenly seemed less frightening. Even when hardship struck, illness, loss, famine, the community was a pillar of support. A seriously ill child would have the whole village searching for medicinal herbs. A family that lost its crops would be given a share of the grain. A house that had partially burned down would be rebuilt with the help of the entire community. No one was abandoned, because if one weak link broke, the whole chain would be shaken. In Viking society, honor and reputation were measured not only by deeds in battle or wealth, but also by how you treated your community. A chieftain was respected not because he was the strongest, but because he knew how to distribute resources, mediate disputes, and ensure that no one starved during the winter. A good neighbor was not just someone who kept their promises, but someone who would give you their last piece of dried fish if you needed it. Try to imagine one winter night, snow covers the roof, and the wind howls at the door. Inside the longhouse, the fire smolders and food is scarce. But when there is a knock on the door, when a distant relative arrives seeking shelter, no one refuses. That person is given a place to sleep and a bowl of porridge, even if it has to be thinned out a little. Because in the Viking mind, helping someone else get through the night was also helping yourself secure a tomorrow. No one survives alone was not just a lesson for the winter. It was the life philosophy of an entire culture. The Vikings did not build their society on isolation, but on connection. No individual was separate from the collective. The strength of each person was only truly complete when it was merged with the strength of the community. And for that reason, in the midst of the long, drawn-out winter, they did not just survive, they became more connected, stronger. They knew that a single hand might tremble, but many hands clasped together could hold up a roof in a blizzard. Close your eyes and picture it. In the longhouse, the fire flickers. Children are curled up in their parents' arms. The elderly are leaning against animal hides. And in the corner, a stranger has also been given a place to lie down. Outside, the winter is cold, but inside there is sharing, there's a common breath, there's the belief that everyone will get through it. That is the greatest strength of all, the strength of community. It was from this community strength and capacity for endurance that with each passing winter, the Vikings not only survived, but also left a quiet yet powerful mark on history, the legacy of resilience. Not magnificent castles, not glittering treasures, but the ability to endure, adapt, and move forward in a harsh world. From the smoky longhouse, from the coarse woolen layers, from the simple stew pot and the warmth of livestock, the Vikings built a culture that knew how to persevere in the face of challenges. In every breath they took, there was the sound of the winter wind. In every step, there was the heavy drag of mud and snow. And in every story told, there was the shadow of long, lightless nights where life was preserved only by willpower and community. What made them different was not that their winters were harsher than elsewhere, but how they embraced them. The Vikings did not complain or wish for an easier life. They prepared, they accepted, and they used hardship itself to forge themselves. To them, every biting wind was just a reminder, be stronger. One generation passed on to the next not great wealth, but small, solid lessons. How to mend a woolen tunic, how to share the last bowl of porridge, how to sit by the fire and tell stories to one another, how to hold on to even the smallest bit of warmth. That was the greatest legacy, the understanding that people can get through any darkness as long as they have faith and each other. Today, many traces of the Vikings have faded into the past. The longhouses are just archaeological sketches, the hearths just ashes in the ground, but their spiritual legacy remains. It lives on in the legends, in the songs, in the customs that have been transformed and spread. It is also present in the very way we tell this story, in a modern world full of comforts, as a reminder that people once survived with only fire, wool, and connection. Imagine, after a long winter, when the ice thaws and the first light of spring shines down, the Vikings step out of their longhouses. They are gaunt, their clothes smell of smoke, their hair is disheveled. But in their eyes there is light. They have passed through the darkness. They have endured, and they are still alive. Each time, winter was not the victor, but just a trial that had been conquered by man. That is the legacy the Vikings left behind. A resilience forged from the cold, a strength molded from hardship. None of them wished for an easy winter, but they all knew overcoming it would make them more resilient, more connected, and more ready for the journeys ahead, in the fields, on the open sea, or in their everyday lives. And as you close your eyes amidst this slow narration, let your mind drift with them. Imagine yourself lying in the longhouse, listening to the crackling fire, feeling the heavy woolen blanket and the warmth of a loved one beside you. Outside, the winter remains. The wind still whistles. But inside there is peace, there is connection, there is the legacy of a people who learned to survive through resilience. The night will be long, but the light will return. And when you open your eyes, perhaps a part of the quiet strength of the Vikings will remain with you. Patience, acceptance, and the belief that in any winter of your life, you too will get through it. My dear friend, we have journeyed together through the long Viking winter, hearing the whistling wind, feeling the warmth of the fire, the wool, and the embrace of the community. Those people have shown us a simple thing. No hardship is permanent, and true strength always comes from resilience and sharing. Now let your eyes close, relax your shoulders, and let your mind rest. May you have a peaceful sleep, as warm as in that ancient longhouse where the darkness outside can no longer reach.